Hey there, this is John Salvino. This is my second or third attempt at trying to do the narration for the 30th anniversary of the Kiska Island adventure that we took on from the offices of James and Moore Anchorage to take care of HTRW investigations out in the Aleutian Islands. Um, I did this once and I got a few comments that I needed to add in some information about how we got there and why Kiska Island was significant. And so I'm re-recording this so that I can add that narration in there and give maybe some clarity to the background of why Kiska was important. Kiska Island was an island that was invaded by the Japanese in, I believe it was 1942, and then retaken by the U.S. forces in 1943. It was part of the Japanese diversion strategy of suggesting that maybe they were going to attack from the north, attack North America from the north, and instead they were going to take a more central or southern route. And this was meant to mobilize U.S. and Allied forces to defend against a northern invasion strategy, when in fact they were going to take a different route. But in the process of doing that, they occupied several islands in the far-off Aleutian chain, including Kiska and Semi-Saposnoy, which were the two islands that the U.S. were trying to look at to reoccupy and defend. So during that time, Japanese left a lot of equipment on the island. The U.S. and Canadian troops left a lot of equipment and fuel and things like that, guns and um, things that might cause environmental concern, put it that way, like waste oil drums, drums of fuel, things like that. And it was our job to kind of look for that as we were doing the site investigation back in 1995. Well, way back then, I had just gotten to Alaska. Um, my friend Gary Hayward, who I worked with when I was in the Gulf Coast, had asked me to travel to Anchorage. I wasn't married at the time. I said, "Could I bring my girlfriend?" He said, "Well, that might not work." And I said, "Well, what if we got married?" So Lori and I flew to Anchorage and got married. And a year later, Kate was born, just before we went off to Kiska. We now live in Atlanta, Atlanta suburbs, I guess, in Woodstock, and with our dog Bowie. If you kind of travel back in time, quite a few things have changed, including Exit Glacier, which was the very first glacier I'd ever seen. Mark Vanya took me down there with the intention of making me committed to the Alaska scenery and the projects. Even though the Exit Glacier has changed over the years, my feelings for Anchorage and the team up there haven't. I've had the ability to reminisce a little bit more than maybe others because I was able to copy a lot of the digital photos as part of the Old Region Symposium presentation that I did back in 1997. The project on Kiska and Semi-Saposnoy followed the CERCLA process for the Army Corps of Engineers to investigate HTRW at the islands and evaluate the islands for remediation. That process included the winter of 1995 planning, um, in, including the sampling analysis plan, the QAPP, the quality assurance plan, the scope of work, budgeting, and throughout the spring of 1995 and summer, we were doing these planning documents and basically the logistics to get out to Kiska Island. Um, that included contacting or the Corps of Engineers contacting the Fish and Wildlife Service to secure an ocean-going vessel that we took out there. We were also able to get Corps of Engineer library documents that included archive photos of the island and maps to help us plan for where we were going to go once we got to Kiska. Like I said, Kiska was retaken by U.S. and Canada forces, and we were able to identify some of those places. Years later, I had the opportunity to interview one of those soldiers who was involved in the reoccupation. We took the Fish and Wildlife vessel, which was under contract to the Corps of Engineers. This is the merchant vessel Tigla, which is stationed in the port of Homer. After all these years, I believe it has been upgraded and retrofitted for additional research work in the Aleutian Islands. This is a quick flyover summary. This isn't the whole slideshow, but this is a flyover summary of where we were and what we did, sort of in sequential process, I guess. Um, we started all our planning documents at the B Street offices of Danes and Moore back in 1995. That's where the offices were. Um, and then we loaded up a lot of the heavy equipment that we couldn't take by plane and drove it down to the port of Homer where the Tigla is stationed and loaded it onto the vessel. That was mostly done by Mark Bonia, who was a key figure in making this whole thing happen. Without his help, none of this would have taken place. I was a project manager, sort of a junior level project manager to Nancy, who was the senior project manager. Her responsibilities included a bunch of other things, so this was my day-to-day project during this time. And Mark and I worked together to make it happen. We mobilized our field team consisting of geologists and biologists and engineers, junior and senior engineers, and we took them out from the Anchorage airport out to Cold Bay, which was just a stopover location so that we could get on another plane out to Adak Island. And we landed at the Adak airport, which is essentially the same location as the 1943 runway, which was built in a matter of days to defend against the Japanese as they were taking over the Aleutians. 1942. We stayed overnight in the contractor's dormitory and left on the Tigla from Adak Harbor with our first stop in Semi-Sepostnoy, where we spent an afternoon collecting samples and looking at topography and the remains of Japanese garrison that was stationed there. From Semi-Sepostnoy, the Tigla took us to Kiska Harbor, where we stayed for the next 3 weeks on our investigation of many different points on the island. Of course, not all of the island. We were selective in targeting areas that were heavily occupied by Japanese or U.S., and including the last remaining building on the island, which I think was a mechanic's hut, maybe a headquarters. We also went to North Head, where there were several gun emplacements. And we took some time at the old airfield. It was initially constructed by hand by the Japanese and then later finished by the U.S. using heavy equipment. We went to Trout Lagoon, where the remains of some of the Japanese ships are still located in the harbor. And we spent an afternoon walking and investigating the area around the subbase, where the remains of 2 Japanese mini-subs still exist. There's one in the old subbase corridor, which was basically pulled in and out of the harbor, and another one that's on the beach. We spent a day on Kiska Island, on Little Kiska Island, where we looked at archaeological features on the island and cultural resources. And if anyone remembers what we found on the beach, that's something I've kept for a long time. We went to Gertrude Cove. Tigla took us to Gertrude Cove, where we were able to access a different part of the island, including Mutt and Jeff Cove, and some of the defensive positions or fishery storage areas that the Japanese used during the war. We took an afternoon to cross the island to go to Quisling Cove, where the remains of a U.S. Army landing craft is still located there at the end of the creek along Quisling Cove. One more place that we went to while we were on the island was Rex Hill, where there was a very early version of a radar station that monitored air traffic along the Aleutians. And there was also lots of evidence of U.S. occupation of that part of the island. We wrapped up our project in about 3 weeks and headed back to the offices on B Street. This is the page from the acknowledgements page from Chuck Mobley's Cultural Resources of Kiska and Semi-Sepostnoy Islands, and he lists the number of people who were out on the island with us, including the Tigla crew and the UXO contractors that were meant to protect us from inadvertently getting ourselves hurt on unexploded bombs and weapons that were still there on the beach for 50 years after Kiska was invaded. This is a picture of most of the people we were working with, all of the Dames and More people, including Chuck Mobley as a contractor and Robert. And over there is Mike. And I don't think Bruce is in this picture. They were the UXO contractors. But there's Nancy and Mike and Jim Dietzman, Mark Vanya. There's Eric. There's Deb, who's a senior engineer out there, and Kristen was a geologist, I believe. And there's George, who was also out there as a technical person providing assistance with the GIS, early GIS versions and tracking information. What a day and what a crew. I haven't kept in touch with hardly any of these people, but I hope we get the chance to listen to this narration and watch the video. If you're tired of my narration already, just turn the sound down and listen to the pictures. These pictures are going to fly by fairly quickly, so I won't be able to describe them all, but pause it and take a look. Like I said in the overview, we flew out to Adak Island, and we had an afternoon where we could drive around and sightsee a little bit. These are part of the Aleutian Island Arc, and they are very far north, so they have grass vegetation and few, if any, trees on any of the islands. The Tigla from the port of Homer set sail for Adak, where we did some training practicing, including getting in a Gumby suit, which is a dry suit that is a survival suit if the ship, for whatever reason, sank and we had to go overboard. So we practiced getting in and out of the suit. And then we were off to Kiska Island, actually off to Semi-Suppositoy first, where back in September we started our investigation of these islands. Semi-Suppositoy is Russian for 7 peaks, and there are 7 volcanic peaks on that island, and we accessed just a small portion which was previously occupied by the Japanese. We got in our Mustang suits and rode the Zodiac to the beach, and then identified some things on the beach before we wrapped up our samples and went to Kiska Island. And at that time, 50 years after World War II, there was still the Army pier that was developed, rarely used, but developed for the occupation. And that was our main point of entry to the island. From there, the engineers and geologists would investigate some of the targeted locations where we saw evidence of activity, maybe like vehicle repair stations, or gun emplacements, or oil seeps, and then we would collect some samples and then send them back to the laboratory. We saw things like batteries and some equipment, shoe repair stations, like I said, vehicle maintenance areas. And our job was basically to see if there was anything left on this island from World War II that would cause harm to someone who happened to be on the island for whatever reason. Our focus was not on unexploded bombs or ammunition. There's some small arms ammunition, but it was more or less to look at things that would cause environmental concern. The UXO people were there for safety precautions to make sure that we wouldn't hurt ourselves by inadvertently stepping on something that would explode. Halfway through the trip, this turbojet was contracted to come out and take some of our samples back to the laboratory so we wouldn't exceed our holding times. And in the process, they brought project manager Nancy DeRigo and Corps of Engineers manager Susan Beecham out. Nancy stayed and Susan left. I think George left with her, along with one of the biologists who had gotten sick during the trip. Part of the investigation included accessing some of these bomb emplacement areas. gun emplacement areas, um, anti-aircraft guns, artillery. Um, I don't know these things specifically, but most of these were Japanese guns that were damaged or rendered inoperable by the Japanese before they left the island and before the U.S. troops invaded. So there was really no battle at Kiska Island because the Japanese had left. One of the parts of the project was to have the biologist from Fish and Wildlife and the James and Moore biologist, Dave Erickson, categorize seabird populations and rats, because these are the rat islands. So they were catching rats and measuring them and taking notes. We did access Little Kiska Island, and here's some pictures, kind of fuzzy pictures of columnar jointing in the basalt that forms Little Kiska Island at Orient Point. Chuck Mobley took some notes on cultural resources of Little Kiska Island, including some old pots and pans that were left behind by presumably Japanese. There's some columnar jointing with a bald eagle sitting on top of it. We went we were able to view a number of shipwrecks out in Kiska Harbor, including Maxima Maru and Borneo Maru, which is in Gertrude Cove. There's a picture of Maxima Maru from 30 years ago, and I think this is a picture from more recently in Brendan Coyle's book about Kiska Island. Here's a picture of Borneo Maru with a lot of, it was used for target practice basically after the Japanese had left. And here's a picture of the sub base with several of us walking along the sub. One of the mini subs was in such good shape they took it back to the US to study it to figure out how to defend against mini sub attacks. They were capable of firing torpedoes from these subs. And one they left in place. The Japanese had destroyed it before they left. And we were taking notes on the exterior condition and interior condition to see if there was anything that would cause any environmental concern. These were battery powered, not diesel powered submarines. Here's a picture of the sub as it was in 1943, and then pictures as it was in 1995. And like I said in Brendan Coyle's book, you can see pictures of how it looked. I think his photographs are from 2012. The batteries could still be an environmental concern based on the amount of lead in the batteries. It was certainly one of the highlights of the trip to see submarines. There's a picture of George and I at the conning tower. And this is a picture of the remaining sub parts that were on the beach. While we were not working, we were able to do some other things on the Tigla, including enjoy the gallery and meals. One day we had halibut that we were able to catch right off of the boat. Most of the work included characterizing conditions around oil seeps and drums, debris piles, just about anything that would cause a potential environmental concern. We were out there in late October, which was a time when the bright green grass was starting to fade. And during that process, you could see some of these oil seeps a little more clearly. So we would walk through the area and look for some of these oil seeps. Some of these oil seeps were the remains of bomb craters after U.S. forces had bombed the area. There were still some unexploded mortar shells. There was one large unexploded bomb that was identified, some TNT on the island. One of the things we tried to do was characterize the geology of the occupied area, including the marshlands, some of the sedimentary deposits and volcanic deposits that are on the island. Primarily, we were trying to characterize damage to the environment from oil releases associated with some of the drums and the equipment. I wish I was better at this because I just had to pause the video because my computer went asleep there for a second. But just to reiterate, we were collecting samples from drum storage areas on different parts of the island. Some of these further reaches of the island were accessed using Mike Foster's ATV vehicles, which were rented to the Corps of Engineers, which was kind of an odd arrangement. We collected samples and packed them out and put them for storage for a short period of time, and then those samples were sent back to the laboratory in Anchorage. There's Mike and Jim at one of the gun emplacements on North Head. There's Mike Clemens around some of the debris piles, and here's four of us near Mutt Cove on another part of the western side of the island, eastern side of the island. Here's a Japanese access point for underground caves and defensive positions. Bald eagles on telephone poles were a common thing. Drums in creek beds were common. I was able to videotape some of the island. I'm not sure what happened to the videotape. And the conditions of some of the infrastructure were categorized by the engineers, including some of the remaining bridges. That was in case we ever had to go back to Kiska to do remedial measures to clean up some of these things that we had found. The remains of some of the Japanese buildings were there, the remains of prehistoric native peoples, including middens, which are essentially garbage dumps of mammal bones and parts, the remains of unexploded TNT, unexploded mortar shells. We found all of that on Kiska. And I have no idea what these were. Maybe they were for storing fish so that they could feed the troops. Maybe they were tank defensive positions. I'm not sure. And there's a picture of Little Kiska Island as we passed by on the way to Gertrude Cove. And we took a hike over to Quisling Cove. This is where we stopped for lunch, where we sat next to a Kiska volcanic bomb that was about 20 miles away from the volcano itself. We made our way across the island on a 6-mile hike and then accessed Quisling Cove and the landing craft that is still there. Go to Google Earth and zoom in on it, and you can still see this orange hulk sitting there in the stream bed. It's a beautiful scenery along the Bering Sea side of Kiska Island. And this is where the Armada from the U.S. Navy had stationed itself so that they could occupy, so that they could send troops onto Kiska Island. We marched our way back out of Quisling Cove, and were able to get a good view of the volcano before we left Kiska Island for Adak and then on to home. On the way home, we were able to see a pod of sperm whale that were swimming around in the Ocean Islands. Like I said, Chuck Mobley did his research and made a publication of the cultural resources of Kiska Island, and Brendan Coyle has put together a more recent book of features on Kiska Island. And there's a picture of us in the Tigla as we were getting back to the boat. Well, I hope that worked. It's kind of a flyby, pretty quick, a description of 30 years ago when we did this project. It meant a lot to me, and I'm sure it meant a lot to some of my friends, and I hope they get the opportunity to see this video. Take care, everyone.